nutrition.
Okay, so Amnon, then Alon, and then the gentleman at the back there. Yes, please.
So, a couple of questions. First, to Udi, I really like the research. I just want to get mind around this notion of polarization that you talk about. So I can understand why vote splitting is counter-polarization. Because if you split your vote, you haven't been polarized. But I'm not so sure, if I split them, but I'm not so sure that by switching, so switching is way more complex, because I can be in the middle and switch to one side, be polarized, I can move to the center, become independent, then I was depolarized. I'm not sure that switching in and of itself is necessarily, it's not linear in my mind how these two things are connected, so maybe you can clarify this a bit.
Well, Maoz, can I had exactly the same reaction. Can I just sharp it? Because I mean, if you have an election with a landslide, right? We have a history of like landslide elections, right? Ronald Reagan in '82, whatever. So a lot of people switched. Does that make the United States more polarized or less polarized, right? Do you see what that's exactly when I asked the question about the conceptualization, it wasn't the formula, but it was just the basic mechanism of what do you code as a unifying versus a polarizing vote. So I had exactly the same reaction as Amnon. Yeah.
As for I love the lecture on the economic indicators and the rise of economics as so a conceptual point. Economy seems to be the new morality, right? So it's not you demoralize, you remoralize, but it's the morality of the market. So the marketplace of ideas, where you buy and sell ideas. It's the whole thing of market. So just conceptual point. But beyond that, I wonder whether you don't actually also you can evade also or avoid the technological dimension. Some would say that, well, when you industrialize in the north, you don't need slavery so much. The South was less industrialized. They say it still needed manual labor in that respect. If only they would have waited and some machines would come and pick up cotton, then they would have released slavery. As some say about us, it's so immoral that we eat meat the way we do. It is about all the slaughter of animals. It is immoral. We do that once technology evolves, and we will develop the artificial, not artificial, but lab-grown meat. We will then say, how could they? The way we say about the U.S. framers, how could they have slaves? The same idea that the technology is actually also a driving force. Really. So, so what I'm trying to understand here is a counterfactual. So what would it take for the Israeli court to actually exercise judicial review when the U.S. doesn't, and vice versa, where the U.S. would exercise review in the Israel? Because you chose a weird example where the result is the same, but the reasoning is different. But under which condition would you also expect the result to be different? Or putting it differently, let's look at the minority methodologically. In both cases, there was a very strong minority position. What would happen if you look at the minority position seriously and see whether there's a difference there or not, and what can you learn from that? And as for now, just a brief question about the timing. So here again, the idea is, can we find a place or a space in modern history for revival? Because you mentioned the revival of elements of the 14th Amendment. How can we explain that? What's driving it? Is it just because the court is originalist, and then what can you do? You have to become originalist in the wrong way, not in the original, as you said it. But so it's a bricolage. You take whatever you have, and this is what you argue with. but you know, maybe there was a different way of arguing it without doing the originalist. So how can we explain is there an explanation beyond the court becoming infatuated with the way things were then? I guess these are my questions.
So we had to discuss it apparently, and we didn't know that. So Mark wanted also to add on...
just briefly on the data. One thing that could produce the data is, in fact, the parties becoming more polarized. So, in fact, say the Herschel-Walker phenomena, that you get ticket splitting or changing vote precisely because at least one party becomes more extreme. So, in fact, the voter hasn't moved at all. It is just as parties become more extreme, you would actually expect to see a little more ticket splitting and change over time.
So it's which variable is the fixed one and which variable is the...
Okay, Professor Riley wanted also to make a comment.
Yeah, actually, my first question was the same question about changing votes, but so it seems to be...
Which same question?
Yeah, but I had another one to Eddie. I wonder what the reasons for the rise of the economic reasoning. And I can see at least two considerations. First of all, people suddenly care more about money than about morality. But I can see other reasons, and I wonder which ones seems to you most plausible. It seems more scientific. There is a rise in kind of scientific rigor and blah, blah, blah. Perhaps it's simply the fact that these things are measurable and therefore more convincing. So I just wonder what made this more salient. If you have an explanation.
So, do you want us to start now? You'll answer, and then we'll take another round of questions. Okay, so Udi, please.
Okay, so thanks for the questions. So think about the literature about polarization, right? What does the literature say? That people, they don't go to the same schools, they don't live in the same neighborhoods, they don't shop in the same shopping malls, they don't work in the same workplaces because of partisanship, okay? So all of those things are important sociologically, economically, and all those behaviors also have political aspects to them, okay? But we're saying, why don't we look at the specific, the most, prominent political behavior, which is voting, okay? And we look at whether people come together behaviorally when it comes to voting. Examples, right? A landslide. Let's do the analogy, okay? So let's say people vote in different, shop in different shopping malls, okay? And then all of a sudden people say, okay, let's shop together in this one shopping mall, okay? This would be an indication for depolarization, okay? People say that they live in separate neighborhoods, okay? And then everybody moves to, or many people move to the same neighborhood. That's a strong indication for depolarization. So if that is an indication for depolarization, then certainly if people in certain election cycles, okay, vote together for the same candidate, and of course it has to do with certain historical circumstances and with the the charisma of the candidate. It's not just the mere voting behavior. There's context around it, right? But this is, I think, a strong indication for depolarization. It might be temporary. It might not be something that lasts necessarily, but this is a strong trend in that sense. And to Mark's point, I didn't show this part, but you talk about the interaction. There's a dynamic interaction here between elite polarization and mass polarization, right? So it is true that maybe in some election cycle, there's something happening in a certain state, a Herschel-Walker candidate, or the candidate for governor in Vermont, or right when the circumstances are such that that the voters would react to the candidates at the elite level. And that is true, but this is an open question, and I think what we're offering here is a way to test it, because we can actually we can track trends over time and see whether there is a trickle-down effect, right, from elites to the masses, right? This is one very strong hypothesis that I don't think was ever really tested, okay? Whether it's the other way around, okay? What is the interaction between elites, the ideology of elites and polarization at the elite level, and at the masses. I don't think we have the theory or the empirical tools right now to really test it. So the kind of hypothesis that you raise, I think is would lend itself to study using this kind of approach.
Eli, please, we'll do it with the order of sitting.
We have a co-author here, so.
I think both to the Reagan point and to your point, I think when we think like on polarization on the mass level, we would expect sort of if the country was indeed so polarized, we'd expect the masses to follow the parties as they should. And with the fact that voters do react to different circumstances, to different candidates, I think it's an indicator. If in a state the voters react to the specifics of the candidates, it means it's less polarized than in the case that they vote strict R or strict D. That's sort of the theory behind it. And in that sense, I think yes, Reagan years, like Reagan '84, is definitely a less polarized America than today. Today we do not see elections won not in 64 numbers and not in 84 numbers.
I mean,
Let's the other people answer also, and then we can continue on the second round. Yes, Eli, please.
Great questions. I'll start with what you're saying about, first of all, I think I agree with you in some ways that economics has become our new morality. I don't know if economists would agree with you. Economists don't like thinking that their arguments are moral ones. Ideas like the just price, which was a common notion throughout most of human history, is considered appalling to them. There can be no just price. There's just one price. But I will say about that I think the difference, and what I tried to show in the stories of microcosmos of the bigger change that happens, is note that what we see here is first the statistics that look at the welfare of the African Americans themselves, even in the South, which I find appalling, but still they're arguing, it's better for the slaves to be under, the black people to be under slavery. And what we have here is basically a reversal of means and ends. So what we see is that people no longer really matter. What their physical well-being doesn't really matter. What matters is economic growth. Of course, if you were economists here, they would say, Eli, well, there's a correlation between economic growth and human welfare. And I would answer and say, I think that in often cases that is the case, but I certainly don't think that's true anymore. I think that we're seeing, for instance, the United States, where we see actually life expectancy going down, things like that, even though we still are having economic growth in the last. So I would say that that's to me the real issue here is just that reversal of ends and means, where you begin to just look at the pie and look at economic growth without looking at the actual physical, social, mental well-being of the people. That's what I really mean when I get at like the question of moral statistics. As to your question about kind of the big why question. So absolutely, I think that there is something. So I read my book. The last chapter of my book is basically economists. The history of economics is a history of trying to tell a story where they can convince us that prices reflect value. And the reason they must have prices reflect value is because prices are so easily quantifiable. They're everywhere. And then I can just pick up the numbers and count them and aggregate them and say, here, this is progress because look, this number is more on this side than it is on that side. So I would say that yes, there's something very basic and something very convincing about kind of creating these economic arguments because prices are these numbers that are everywhere and they're so very easily kind of collected and priced. So I would definitely say that one of the biggest projects of economics as a science in the last, 150, 200 maybe years is, by the way, the story changes. Sometimes they give arguments that price equals value because of the labor theory of value. Then it becomes subjective theories of value because prices reflect our wants and our needs. It changes, but that stays the same. And I think that is, at the end of the day, one of the more dominant reasons why it's incredibly attractive, I think, and very easy. And I definitely agree that it's one number that you can then use to compare things. Okay, so I definitely agree with you. I think that is one of the reasons why it's so attractive. I forgot the technology question. I'll just add. First of all, historians have shown, I think it's very interesting, that there's a lot of technological progress in the South. I mean, if you just look at the steamboats, for instance, none of this kind of big cotton industry could have happened without steam engines. So granted that the factories aren't, the farms themselves aren't factories, but there's definitely pretty significant industrialization going on. And then the other thing I would just say is just about this question is, these are kind of big arguments that people have right now. Is like, what actually was going to happen in the South if the Civil War never happened? And I think there are a lot of historians right now who think that, if you look at GDP growth, if you look at the prices of slaves, if you look at generally, the certainly political power, and this gets to the stuff we talked about last night, it didn't seem like it was going anywhere, and it didn't seem like they had created, an economic model where, sure, we were going to have the factories, but we're going to, remember, the cotton is going into factories. So in that sense, also the Industrial Revolution is very much connected to the slave. So I don't see any technical or other reason why suddenly, it would have ended. So in that sense, I'm glad the Civil War happened because I don't think it would happen very quickly necessarily.
Okay. Evie, Mark, can you make a comment
How about we'll pause. I think if you're willing to pause.
Okay, I'm willing to pause. First of all, we can end later because this is the last session. So I think, we can take more questions. But I have a lot to say about the other.
Then you can just reply to the
okay.
before you forget the questions.
So I would first want to respond to some of the ideas that we heard today. So first of all, to Mark, I'm curious about whether debates about what institution should disqualify the candidates, like more focus on the mechanism of disqualification. Like that's my question to you. Udi, I wonder about the issue of strategic voting, right? And the intensity of the elections, actually, or the intensity of the elections, of the issues at election, etc. Because supposedly, actually, maybe if I'm more polarized, I'm more willing to move or split my vote or whatever because I want to be strategic. Like, think about what happened in Israel in the last election. You start thinking about, okay, what's the list? You have time to figure out where should I put my vote so it counts the most, right? So actually, how does it challenge your thesis? I was thinking about the economics and the Civil War, and Eli, I think that my application was actually about the Haredi community and economics, like how it's going to play out. Now, it's an interesting comparison because supposedly who is serving all of us, right? But nonetheless, think about the implications actually about, with regard to the Haredi community. Okay, so I will want to discuss a little bit the question, Amnon's question. So I was actually expecting much more pushback. So the fact that there are so many political scientists in the room, and I'm not getting this pushback, so I see it as an advantage. And Mark, I want to thank you. But what?
Because it's late.
It's late, but you're still invited to. I want to actually thank you because the first time I was actually presenting the project was at your Shmuz conference, so I thank you. You are the one that actually prompted me to have this paper out. So if I'm thinking about your question, Amnon, then I think that the result would have been totally different if we had an executive ban in Israel and a legislative ban in the US. Notice what the examples I'm using, the two cases, are a case in which there is an executive ban in the US, so there was a statutory scrutiny and a constitutional scrutiny. And in Israel, there was a legislative ban. Now, I can guarantee you that if we had only an executive ban in Israel, it would have been over. You are saying immediately. Right.
Any executive,
right. No, and why? Why can you nonetheless make the comparison? Why the executive ban in the US is actually almost equivalent to a legislative ban in Israel? This is exactly the issue of the working of separation of powers. The fact that you have a deference doctrine in the US, but you do not have a deference doctrine in Israel. So this is exactly, if you want an example, it's actually, these two cases are the example, and I discuss it in the article. And again, the article is unnecessary for anyone who wants to see a further elaboration of the arguments. But the minority, the fact that there was a strong minority only helps my thesis. Because, and I discussed at great length actually the majority and minority opinions. Because even though there was strong reasons why you could have envisioned the court intervening, they opted not to intervene, and then you see why. You see the workings of separation of powers. You really see that. What's nice about the exercise, it's not just that the thesis, I think, is very interesting, that you see that actually, because, we have this problem. How do you actually, it's very hard to prove. How do you prove the relationship between the structure of separation of power and judicial power? Right? There are so many variations in the different countries, so many contexts. How do you start measuring the two? So once you think about the translation mechanism, and you see that the doctrines are the same, even same levels, justiciability, standing, deference or non-deference, the labels are the same, but the content is so different, and the courts use separation of powers explanations at the individual level. So you see this emerging picture in which, yes, separation of powers matter. In a weak one, you would see augmentation through common law doctrines, and vice versa in weak and strong. You see the translation mechanism. That's why I enjoyed so much the project. And what I do also in the paper, I actually show already, it's like a template for comparative constitutional law. Here, you want to compare two cases, look at all these indicators. This is what you should look at when you do the comparison. So I was actually having a lot of fun with the project. So, okay.
Mark, please.
A number of things, brief. One, there's a really good question on who does the disqualification. And again, this is an interesting challenge in history, because Republicans in 1866 could not imagine a court leading the charge. The answer is not they were legislative supremacists. The answer is not they were judicial supremacists. They simply thought whatever action was going to happen as a practical fact was happening from Congress. And so questions that are extremely important to us do not show up in 4,500 pages of the Congressional Globe, that we wind up, these are our questions and our problems and not theirs. Now, when I was asked to testify and said I would be a paid expert witness, my first response was, don't you know that everything you want me to say is completely inadmissible? And the lawyer, who was very good, said, yes, I know in theory, with this judge who's a history buff, we're going to get all of it in. Okay, you want to pay me that sum and take the risk that after I say my name, the judge says, guess what, you can't testify? Sure. But the truth is, I was simply asked to testify about the 19th century, and I was actually very clear as an anti-originalist. What I said was not anything in public meaning, but is my estimation. This is how Republicans understood some things. I refuse to answer questions on what this means today. So I was simply acting as the historian I am, but there's a debate going on now in various blogs, liberal communities. What arguments do you use? And the answer is, I think, if you're a lawyer and not an academic, you make the arguments you think are going to win unless you regard them as morally too far outside. So there's some arguments you don't make. But while I think originalism is nonsense, while I think it is incoherent, I don't think it's immoral. And if it, basically, if a judge tells me my client will not be executed if I can kiss a frog without wincing the week before the trial, I'm going to be kissing lots of frogs.
Till they become princesses or princes.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have two questions at the back and then Amichai. Okay, so.
My question is to Ricky. It seems that the dialogue between the court and the legislature in the Israeli context has been addressed in more, let's say, tailored judgments, for example, the Kvantinsky judgments, which specifically says, I mean, if the legislator will go in the, let's say, more distinct or accurate process of legislation, do your dialogues, make the whole process how it should be, and don't just blitz legislate. Really properly legislate. I will make this constitutional. And I think that this judgment, and of course it can be a key judgment in our constitutional situation, can be more tailored rather than the judgment that you had given, because the legislator did not respond. I mean, just renewed the law. And of course, there are more, let's say, more accurate or perhaps specific judgments that address this, and vice versa as well, because you can see in contract law that the legislator did respond and the court kind of ignored the legislator's response. So I do wonder about maybe more nuances of this very complex relationship between separation of powers and judicial review.
Can you more questions? I will answer.
Yeah,
Thank you.
we have only Eden also.
I think
And
Elizabeth.
the lady at the back. Yeah, please.
Okay, my question is to Eli. Maybe, like, what I didn't grasp, maybe because of the briefness of the presentation, is what exactly is the conclusion of your research? Because I sure understood that there's a connection between economic indicators and, say, change in legislation or in, society. But is the conclusion that it necessarily led to civil war, or that it necessarily led to societal change? And if it is the latter, would you advocate for using economic indicators elsewhere? For example, the example that came to mind for me was, for example, in trying to mitigate the climate catastrophe by being like, hey, look at how much it would cost us to continue doing what we're doing.
So continuing your point, I wonder how much an Israeli can really look at what the court do and how much it intervenes with the government's doing when it buys into a lot of security measures and security rationale that the court that is given by the state. So it also includes with family unification. But eventually, even if the court says that there is a right for family unification, the whole security issue is so hard to put on, and we're going to buy into your assertion that it might cause more trouble, so we're not going to intervene. So the court pick and choose how it believes the state when it comes to its rationale for certain legislation, for certain policies and doctrine. So that's all.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you for the question. The project is trying to make a nexus, and this is actually also the title of the article, trying to make a nexus. I have many articles on the nexus, right? So this is another one in that series. So the idea is to try to connect between the strengths of separation of powers in a given system and the strengths of judicial power. Now, in order to do that, I need to juxtapose a system outside Israel, right? Because I want to see a strong separation of power case, a weak separation of power case, and how do the courts come about, how the reasoning is built. So this is why I chose these two cases. Now, Komatinsky is actually an example. I don't see it as a modest or a careful judicial intervention in legislative action, even though the justice who wrote the opinion is actually Justice Solberg, who is actually associated with conservatism. And the reason is, and I write about it, I have actually a piece on about in Hebrew, actually in the blog Reichman, that is also part of a broader project. The reason is that the whole idea that the court can actually review the internal proceedings of parliament is so radical when you don't have any base for it in law. It's totally common law made, right? So it's actually a decision that is very much outside the regular process of judicial intervention, even in parliamentary systems. Okay, so Komotinsky would actually show that in weak separation of power structure you see the court augmenting judicial power, but it wouldn't work in the direction you suggested.
But at the same time, you can't say that the court practically said, well, if you will separate yourself in the parliamentary system itself, I mean, as long as the legislative process will go by the book, I will intervene less.
Okay, so the if is, you know the result. The end result is that we don't have a statute that actually taxes people if they have 3 apartments. And why is that so? Because, you know, it's nonetheless the powers of inertia, etc. It's not, okay, it's not such a simple case, but I'm just trying to explain to you why I chose this particular case as not Komotinsky. Now, about your question, Eden, which is an amazing question. If you read my article on the strengths, on the Nexus, you will see that what I explain is that courts in both systems find it very hard to invalidate statutes based on the purpose of the legislation or the executive order, etc. Because then you are actually ruling out the option for the representative bodies to pursue their policy, even by other means. And courts do not usually do so on separation of powers grounds. So this is actually a case where you have convergence in the 2 systems, even though you have strong and weak separation of power structures, okay? So.
Okay, Eli, you get to close.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, you know, 15 minutes it's hard, so just to be clear, I was trying to make 2 main arguments. First of all, I was using the sectional debates, the arguments over the North and the South, to show a broader shift that occurred in America, where people were measuring progress through these moral statistics to people measuring progress through these economic indicators. Then at the very end, I just added, and I go through much more detail in the book, is that specifically this shift to economic indicators and economic anti-slavery. So an argument that basically says slavery to people in the North, especially elites in the North, but not all, also middle classes, that basically the idea is slavery, the reason slavery is bad is not because we necessarily care about the welfare of the blacks, but because you personally are being economically hurt by the fact, because the GDP is being hurt and the growth is being hurt and all. That was a very convincing narrative that basically brought more people on board for this economic anti-slavery, made it mainstream instead of this kind of fringe kind of moralizing, and essentially, I would say, argue, allowed Abraham Lincoln to win the election, which then, you know, necessitated the secession of the South and the start of the Civil War. So and then very briefly about, so I've written about this actually, the Stern Review was the first time that ever they tried to do a cost-benefit analysis on global warming, and I think it's pretty clear from the results that this is not the way we should be going. Stephen Margolin, who was a professor of economics at Harvard, who I worked with, actually showed that if you kind of look at their numbers, and if you look at this, the stock price of McDonald's in the last like 30 years, like the results show that we're better off investing in McDonald's stock than we are in saving the world. I'm not kidding. It's like just the numbers are just completely off, and this has to do with all sorts of different things. There's questions here about uncertainty, you know, how do you measure these things? There's questions about discount rates, how do you price the future? And then the other big question here, which is basically a political question, it's not something we can just let technocrats kind of decide, it's just not going to work. And then the last thing also is how do you actually value, you know, the earth, how do you value fish, how do you value, and usually the way they do that is kind of like, you know, well, how much is that fish worth to the economy? So not, you know, and so for all these different reasons, I'm not the only one who's written about this. I strongly suggest that we do not use economic indicators to kind of like argue for why we need to stop climate change.
Okay.
We do that, or we invest in McDonald's.
So please join me in saying thank you.